here, so let's get started. So welcome everybody to today's session. Hi, Licia. So today's session is Disability and the Problem of Dehumanization, and we've got two speakers and two commenters. So our first speaker is going to be Professor David Smith. Professor Smith is a professor of philosophy at the University of New England, and his talk is going to be called Unnatural Bodies, Disability as Metaphysical Threat. Commenting on his talk is going to be Professor Joel Reynolds of Georgetown University. Professor Reynolds is a professor of philosophy and disability studies. He's also a senior research scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics and a senior advisor to the Hastings Center. Then our second talk is going to be given by Professor Licia Carlson of Providence College. Her talk is going to be called The Many Faces of Dehumanization. And then finally, Corinne Lajoie is going to be commenting. Corinne is a PhD student in philosophy and women's gender and sexuality studies at Pennsylvania State University. So with those brief introductions, I'm going to hand things off to David. Do you have everything you need?
Everything except my brain.
Okay. Well, the floor is yours, David.
Okay. So let me start. I have this private philosophical taxonomy. I don't think I've ever shared it with anyone. But I kind of group philosophers into these two categories. There are the puzzle solvers and there are the painters. And puzzle solving, of course, gets has had a lot of press in philosophy. Painters are people who do philosophy by kind of presenting a picture of the world, picture that they've thought about and they think is worth considering. In practice, of course, usually we're all a mix of painterly and puzzle-solvingly philosophical effort. But I just want to say I'm more towards the painter end. So the style may be a little bit, maybe not, a little bit unusual. And certainly what I want to talk to you about today is at the painter end. It's a picture, really not a painting, more a rough sketch of some thoughts I have about disability and dehumanization. And normally I just prefer just talking rather than reading. But I'm really worried that if I just talk, I will exceed the time boundary even before I've gotten going. So if you'll bear with me, I will read, but I will try to give a somewhat dramatic reading so it's not insufferably boring to you. Okay, so here I go. Someone will caution me about time, right? When, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, a group of 18 German physicians who participated in the killing of more than 50 disabled children at Rothenburgsort Pediatric Hospital were brought to trial on charges of crimes against humanity. The hospital director, Dr. Wilhelm Bayer, rejected the charge. As historian Johann Chapoutot describes it, quote, "Such a crime," he asserted, "can only be committed against people, whereas the living creatures that we were required to treat could not be qualified as human beings." Dr. Bayer, with great sincerity, kept reiterating that doctors and legal experts had for decades been advising modern governments to shed the weight of useless mouths. These beings were barely human, they asserted. They were corrupted biological elements, and their defects and pathologies risked being passed on if they reproduced. End of quote from Chapoutot's book. It's called The Law of Blood, by the way. I highly, highly recommend this book. The judges, moved by this defense, found the 18 physicians not guilty, and Bayer was allowed to keep his medical license. His views, not just about eugenics, but also about the subhumanity of many disabled people were widely shared. In a 1964 interview, now where's my page 2? All right. Where is my page 2? Right. I don't have my page 2. So, oh, there it is. Double-sided print. In a 1964 interview published in Der Spiegel, Werner Kattel, the distinguished professor of pediatrics, who had initiated the Nazi so-called euthanasia program, and who would describe mentally disabled children in his book Grenzsituation des Lebens as, quote, such monsters are nothing but a massa carnis, a mass of flesh, remarked, quote, we're not talking about humans here, but rather about beings that were merely procreated by humans, and that will never themselves become humans endowed with reason and a soul, end of quote. As these statements, which are clearly meant to be understood literally, attest, disabled people, qua-disabled people, have been and continue to be dehumanized. But their dehumanization has somewhat different dynamics than the kind of dehumanization that I have devoted the last 15 years of my life to study. The form of dehumanization that I've been most concerned with is closely tied to racialization. That's why I sometimes describe it as racism on steroids. But the dehumanization of disabled people does not conform precisely to this pattern. It works differently and needs to be considered on its own terms. It is striking how often disabled people have been described as monsters, and reactions to them have often featured the word horror. I contend that these characterizations hold the key to understanding the inner workings of the dehumanization of the disabled, because they reflect a set of entrenched and immensely destructive folk metaphysical assumptions about humanity, subhumanity, and the metaphysical status of disabled people. If I am right, the derogation of disabled people, as it is manifested both in speech and acts of violence and oppression, runs much deeper than mere bigotry or callousness, because disabled people are regularly experienced as an affront to the natural order and to the place of human beings within it. I want to make it clear at the outset that I am not a disability studies scholar. I was invited to contribute to this panel, and I accepted the invitation on the basis of my work on dehumanization, which has hitherto focused very little on the dehumanization of disabled people. However, I'm now convinced that the project of understanding the forms of dehumanization that disabled people are subject to is of very considerable theoretical importance, both in its own right and because it may provide a lens through which other manifestations of the dehumanizing impulse may be fruitfully viewed. In this paper, I will draw on elements of the theoretical apparatus that I have developed for explaining racialized dehumanization and use it to address the dehumanization of disabled people. This is a first attempt at what I envisage as a large, longer-term project. Finally, I want to beg listeners' indulgence as I seem to meander through topics that seem to be unrelated to the very serious, concrete issues pertaining to disability. I promise you, it will all come together by the end. My title is Unnatural Bodies. So I want to begin by clarifying the notion of unnaturalness, so as to get a fix on what it is for a body to be regarded as unnatural. If something is unnatural, it is not natural. But it's not the case that everything that's non-natural is felt to be unnatural. John Stuart Mill's posthumously published essay on nature is helpful for sorting this out. In it, Mill distinguishes three senses of nature. and therefore of the natural. Only one of these helps us with the notion of the unnatural. Used in Mill's first sense, nature consists of all that exists, and therefore no existing thing is unnatural in this sense. To say that something is not natural in this first sense is to say that it's fictional. Used in his second sense, nature consists of all that is not a product of or touched by human artifice. To say that something isn't natural in this sense is to say that it's artificial. The notion of the unnatural is the inversion of Mill's third sense of natural, as the way things should be. To say that something is not natural in this third sense is to say that it is a way that a thing of that kind should not be. So an unnatural body is a body that does not conform to the way that human bodies are supposed to be. Finally, the notion of how bodies are supposed to be is cultural, but presented as something natural. What does this mean? To get a handle on it, it's helpful to turn to the anthropological classic, Impurity and Danger, 1966, by Mary Douglas. Douglas develops a theory of impurity in the book. I interpret her position as follows. Human societies operate with concepts of the natural order. These frameworks have two components. They consist of a system of categories in which metaphysical assumptions, in which every kind of natural thing has an allotted place, and a system of relations that obtain between these categories. This notion of the natural order is not simply descriptive. It consists of a view of how things should be, but from which they can deviate. The natural order can be disrupted in at least two ways. First, the natural relations between kinds can be subverted. For example, if one's conception of the natural order involves the idea that women are rightly subordinate to men, women subordinating men, or asserting their equality with men are an affront to the natural order. Second, an item can transgress the boundaries of the natural order by failing to fit into any of the categories that constitute that order. The second of these, the idea of metaphysical boundary transgression, has been immensely important in my work on dehumanization. Specifically, it has been crucial for explaining how the process of dehumanization transforms dehumanized people into monsters in the eyes of their dehumanizers. The link between Douglas's account and monstrosity can be found in the work of Noel Carroll, who uses Douglas to analyze the monsters found in horror fiction. Carroll is entirely concerned with giving an account of the aesthetics of horror and does not extend his model to give an account of the real-life horrors of genocide and oppression. But modifying his framework and terminology, I argue that in the most dangerous form of dehumanization, dehumanized people who are transformed into monstrous or demonic beings are represented by their dehumanizers as both physically threatening and what I call metaphysically threatening. Carroll calls this cognitively threatening. They are metaphysically threatening because they seem to violate the boundaries that comprise the natural order, thus rendering them unnatural beings. The monster is, as Foucault put it, quote, the transgression of classification. As applied to art horror, which is Carroll's term for horror fiction, movie zombies are a good example of Carroll's thesis. Zombies are clearly physically threatening, but they are not only malevolent, they are also metaphysically threatening in virtue of being both alive and dead. Simultaneously, They are decaying cadavers that nonetheless walk and eat. It is this, rather than their physical malevolence, that makes them so disturbing. And in the case of exterminationist dehumanization, the persecuted group is typically regarded as essentially destructive and criminal, physical threat, as well as being at once human and less than human, metaphysical threat. So in Carroll's analysis, right, there are these two components of the fictional monster. Fictional monster must be dangerous in the same way that a murderer is dangerous or a grizzly bear is dangerous, physically threatening, but also must be metaphysically threatening as being an impossible combination of mutually exclusive properties or mutually exclusive kinds. Why are certain category transgressions so disturbing? Why do they elicit a horrified response? H.P. Lovecraft gives us a clue when he writes that the essence of the horrific is the apprehension of, quote, a malign and particular suspension of those fixed laws of nature, which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space, end of quote. The malign and demonic components can be subtracted from Lovecraft's description as they pertain to the physical threat that's posed by monsters, rather than their metaphysically threatening character. Once we do this, we are left with the idea, extracted from Lovecraft's account, that category transgression is metaphysically threatening because it calls the natural order into question. Consider the following example from Arthur Macon's novel, The House of Souls. What would your feelings be, the character asks, if your cat or your dog began to talk to you and to dispute with you in human accents? He goes on to say, you would be overwhelmed with horror. I'm sure of it. And if the roses in your garden sang a weird song, you would go mad. And suppose the stones in the road began to swell and grow before your eyes. And if the pebble that you noticed at night had shot out stony blossoms in the morning. End of quote. Singing roses and blossoming pebbles are not physically threatening, but they are disturbing because they undermine the sense of security that the natural order provides. If rose bushes can sing and pebbles can grow, then metaphysical solid ground vanishes from beneath our feet. The distinctive affective response to metaphysical threat is often characterized as the experience of the uncanny. In German, unheimlich, in Japanese, bukimi. I think that the most important paper on this subject is Ernst Jentsch's 1906 on the psychology of the uncanny, in which he tries to distill the nature of uncanniness. Jentsch argues that this feeling results from one's mind being pulled in two incompatible directions at once. More precisely, when one is drawn to assigning a thing to two incompatible categories at once. One of his examples is the realistic figures in a wax museum. One initially responds to them as though they're people, but they also have characteristics of non-people, i.e. inert, sculpted pieces of wax. Jentsch argues that as long as the viewer's mind cannot settle on one or other of these interpretations, to the exclusion of the other, the figures are felt to be unheimlich, disturbing, unsettling, creepy. Jentsch describes this psychological state as a condition of uncertainty, but I don't think that this is the best formulation of what he was reaching for. The visitor to the wax museum does not waver back and forth between seeing the figures as human beings and lumps of wax. Rather, the visitor thinks of the figures as simultaneously human and non-human, animate and inanimate, which renders them metaphysically threatening in virtue of transgressing a metaphysical boundary. Jensch argues that movement enhances this disturbing effect, a point nicely developed by Masahiro Mori, who independently hit on the same idea. Mori is writing in 1970. Quote, imagine a craftsman being awakened suddenly in the dead of night, he writes. He searches downstairs for something among a crowd of mannequins in his workshop. If the mannequins started to move, it would be like a horror story. End of quote. There is another important feature of the uncanny that Jensch does not highlight, but which is implicit in his account. To get at it, let's change the example scenario from a wax museum to a hardware store. Suppose you enter a hardware store and see a piece of equipment that looks at first glance like a lawnmower. Then you notice it also looks like a snowblower. You're plunged into a state of uncertainty. Is it a lawnmower or is it a snowblower? Unlike the wax museum spectator, you do not experience the machine as metaphysically threatening in virtue of violating a metaphysical boundary. The two interpretations, lawnmower or snowblower, do not exclude one another, as the animate-inanimate binary does. There's a large body of psychological research that throws light on why, unlike contradictory beings, hybrid artifacts are not experienced as uncanny. It has to do with the phenomenon known as psychological essentialism, a disposition to carve the world of living things up into natural kinds, each of which is individuated by the possession of an unobservable essence that is possessed by only and all members of that kind, and which is normally causally responsible for the observable properties that are typical of that kind. Essences are categorical. Yes.
David, I'm just going to jump in really quickly. We're about at time. So if you could sort of wrap up your remarks, that'd be fantastic.
I'm going to have to find, I'm sorry. Okay. Even though I shortened this. Okay, so let me kind of cut to the chase here. So if you look, so there's this picture of a certain kind of threat, a very compelling kind of threat, metaphysical threat. And as I mentioned right at the beginning of this presentation, if you look at the literature, and I'm just a beginner in this, like I said, this is the beginning of a much larger project. It is remarkable the degree to which disabled people, particularly congenitally disabled people, but not exclusively, are first of all described as monsters. In fact, Douglas herself refers to monstrous births. And second, the word horror is used repeatedly in relation to such people. And I think this really needs to be taken seriously. And we can draw on this apparatus, which I've kind of derived from various sources, to give an account of racialized dehumanization, to explicate and to analyze this extremely destructive, aversive attitude towards certain kinds of disability. Now, it normally, but again, not entirely, normally, say in the Nazi cases I began with, these disabled children are not seen as physically threatening. They're not out to kill you or eat your brains like zombies or anything like that. But I submit that there's a lot of mileage to be got from the hypothesis that they are seen as metaphysically threatening. They're seen as violations of what's taken to be the natural order, uncanny combinations of incompatible kinds, because their bodies are not paradigmatically human bodies within the metaphysical framework that adhered to German culture, particularly Nazi culture, and adheres to many other cultures. who have problems with unusual bodies. Okay, I'll wrap it there then.
Thank you so much, David. I'm going to suggest that we give a little Zoom applause hands. Okay, and now Joel, I'm going to hand it over to you for the commentary.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, David, for that really provocative talk, and provocative in the sense that there was some stuff in there. I'm like, I did not know that, and oh my goodness, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with everyone today. Just real quick, in terms of accessibility housekeeping, if anything's going wrong, please interrupt me. And in terms of content warning, I guess you already know from David's talk, there's going to be some very intense content in this session today. I'm going to start with two quick quotes. One is from Rosemary Garland Thompson. This is from her New York Times piece called Becoming Disabled. And it reads, confused responses to racial or gender categories can provoke the question, what are you? Whereas disability interrogations are, what's wrong with you? And then a quote from our own David Livingstone Smith, when we dehumanize others, we regard them as simultaneously human and non-human. Over the last 50 years, debates concerning speciesism underwent a historic reversal. For a significant swath of the Western intellectual tradition, I won't specify exactly how much because then we'll get into a painful historical debate, what we today call the species line functioned often as a marker of not just biological and physiological, but also moral, political, and spiritual difference. Though articulated in different ways across epochs and traditions, the theoretical dominance of the great chain of being often held strong. Today, however, to assert the species line as such a marker calls out for charges of empirical ignorance, as well as often moral consternation, especially given recent discoveries about the social life and cognitive processes of a huge range of other organisms, ranging from octopuses, ravens, elephants, bumblebees, and ranging from the practices they engage in, like grieving the dead, playing games, complex forms of abstraction, you name it. The idea that the species line should in and of itself determine moral worth has come to be pilloried by many, many figures. Singer, Duvall, Korsgaard, you name it. There is, however, a significant cost to this reversal, as scholars from a range of traditions and specialties have argued that anti-speciesism, at least as it is defended by proponents who articulate a capacity-based view, I'll return to that in a bit, that this diminishes the standing and even banishes certain people from the moral universe. Namely, though not only, it banishes those with certain types of impairments, whether those are a result of birth, events across the life course, or any number of inevitable processes of aging. It also ignores, in a, I think, truly astonishing way, all the psychological and historical work suggesting that the concept of humanity is not simply useful for, but perhaps even necessary for pro-social interactions, and specifically across groups. For simplicity, I'll henceforth, in my remaining 7 minutes, refer to the many concerns that result from disagreements over the proper role of the concept of the human and over the role of the species line. I'll just refer to this as the problem of speciesism. Now, scholarship concerned with the exclusion of certain disabled people from the anti-speciesist orbit has, on the whole, anchored arguments in moral traditions that center upon questions of distributive justice and equity, such as versions of the social contract theory, care ethics, etc. On the contrary, scholarship concerned with the moral indefensibility of the species line has, on the whole, anchored arguments in moral traditions that center on questions of pain and pleasure, and on moral features like duty, often in relation to sentience. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, much of this debate, or at least I certainly feel this way, it seems like each side is arguing past each other, as if ships in the dead of night. Now, to be sure, disagreement between these two camps is in part a consequence of the fate of different priors, of different theoretical frameworks, premises, inferences, and intuitions. But this is not the end of the story. As I see it, one of the more profound insights of David's work or I should probably say applications of his work in my mind, is that the problem of speciesism and the question of the human ultimately turns not on moral traditions or normative principles, obligations, or other such things. It instead turns on how we in fact tend to treat and think about each other. That is to say, by looking primarily to ethics, as moral philosophers tend to do, looking to ethical concepts, looking to ethical principles, ethical systems, by doing that to address the problem of speciesism, and even by doing that to address any number of injustices in the world, is ass backwards. We should instead turn primarily to social psychology and intellectual history. Ethics, important as it is, must build off the latter, not the reverse. Now, on this view, if you're convinced by that way of thinking about things, anti-speciesist arguments, like those of McMahon, Singer, etc., anti-speciesist arguments without an anchor in how we in fact tend to think and treat each other should be viewed as prima facie suspect, for they disregard, or perhaps actively ignore, the historied, well-documented problem that dehumanization presents, as well as the millions upon millions of deaths it has motivated over the historical record. Consider the following claim from Sylvia Wynter in her piece, No Humans Involved, an open letter to my colleagues. Wynter is in this piece responding to evidence that surfaced after the acquittal of the 1991 police beating and torture of Rodney King. LA police, it was discovered, would regularly refer to engagement with young Black males via the acronym NHI, which means No Humans Involved. Wynter argues, quote, and this piece is fascinating. If you haven't read this essay, I highly recommend it. It's extremely rich and important. Wynter writes, the classificatory logic of the acronym NHI derives from, among other things, the fallacy of supraculturalism. And what she means by that is she says it mistakes our present local culture's representation of the human as a natural organism as if it were the human in itself. It mistakes the representation for the reality, the map for the territory. In short, I think one of the many things Wynter's up to in this particular piece is to argue that the modern scientific paradigm, so the one, let's say, predicated not simply on the empiricism of Bacon and Galileo and others, but a paradigm that sets the stage for a Darwinian and post-Darwinian understanding of what Marx would later call our Gattungswesen, our species being, right? That paradigm for Wynter is foundationalist. It assumes that it knows what it is to be human relative to a positivistic understanding of science, in a very Western sense of that term, instead of, for example, arguing what it should be to qualify as human by positing that as something that is not up to any of the domains of science. And Richard Rorty, just randomly, I'm going to quote Richard Rorty just for no reason, but no, he offers a really provocative insight here. So I want to quote this line and then I will wrap up. He says, the best and probably the only argument for putting foundationalism behind us is that it would just be more efficient to do so, because it would let us concentrate our energies on manipulating sentiments, on sentimental education. That sort of education sufficiently acquaints people of different kinds with one another so that they're less tempted to think of those different from themselves as only quasi-human. He didn't quite get David's insight that it's both human and non-human at the same time, but he was close. And of course, his final line here, he says, the goal of this manipulation of sentiment is to expand the reference of the terms, our kind of people and people like us. In other words, Rorty thinks that once one realizes that human beings do not contain some special ingredient that is told to us by evolutionary biology or whatever the field, and once one also realizes how human beings in fact think, then the solution to cruelty, genocide, torture, and all other manner of effects of dehumanization is to better demarcate the target range of beings for whom we should care as people, whether those are human animals, whether those are any number of non-human animals, or hell, non-animal beings. Final paragraph. Putting together the work of David Livingstone Smith, Sylvia Winter, and also Eva Katay, I think one can more clearly see the historical stakes of utilitarian arguments like that of Singer and McMahon. The idea that humans are defined by their capacities is a founding premise behind dehumanization, insofar as it allows one to say that while someone might look, talk, walk, and otherwise seem like a human, they aren't really so if they don't have some more essential feature, whether that's a cognitive feature, whatever it is. We can regard them, in other words, on these sorts of views as simultaneously human and non-human. And if it's the case, we have good reasons from social psychology and history that thinking of other humans as less than or not human, or as simultaneously human and not human, is going to provide fodder for dehumanization. And I think we do have good reasons to think that. Then we have good reasons to jettison capacity-based views like that of Peter Singer and Jeff McMahon. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joel. Let's go with our little Zoom applause hands again. Okay, David, I'm going to hand it back to you. I'm going to give you 3 minutes for your reply because we're a little over time, and then we're going to go into Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Joel. That was so interesting. In fact, I listened to it. I was so absorbed in what you were saying, I forgot I'm supposed to reply. So I want to underline that the category of the human is not a transparent category at all, as Joel was saying, but we can actually go further than Sylvia Winter goes there. Even within science, it's not a transparent category. So if you look at the paleoanthropological literature, it's really all over the map. I mean, they're all part of the primate lineages, but human is sometimes used to refer to the genus Homo, sometimes the species Homo sapiens, sometimes the subspecies Homo sapiens sapiens, sometimes a much larger category of the lineage. So the curious thing is it's not discussed in science. It's like Neanderthals will be called early humans by some and pre-humans by others and so on. And then when we get out of science, of course, it's really all over the map. So for instance, the Quran of Papua New Guinea, I believe that cassowaries are reincarnations of female ancestors. And cassowary is a big bird. It's kind of an ostrich-like bird. Famously, in racist regimes, the racially subordinated group is referred to as subhuman, in a radical sense of non-human. So it's a politically fraught concept, which properly speaking, isn't part of any scientific vocabulary. It's a folk concept. Now, does that mean there's no coherent notion of the human? I think there is in practice. I think in practice, human means my kind, my fundamental kind, my essential kind. It's very similar to an indexical term, right? It's the speaker's kind. And so the human is constituted by acts of inclusion and identification. And that boundary is immensely malleable. Okay.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, let's open it up for Q&A. So I'll take hands in the order that I see them and just use the little raise hand function. And I won't take questions in the chat. All right, Tim, you're up. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I'm curious what you think about cases where there's obvious neither human nor not, but we respond with delight or awe, like some of the science fiction robots and somewhat human creatures. How do you account for that when it doesn't seem to be a response of horror?
Yeah, so I actually think that there is a close relationship between the horror sentiment, with the uncanny sentiment, and certain kinds of religious sentiments. So, and we find the same pattern, actually, because deities and other spiritual entities are typically represented as violating metaphysical categories. They're combinations of, they're impossible combinations of properties, or say like the ancient Egyptian deities are combinations of human bodies and animal bodies and so on. So there is a kind of connection there. It's very important, I think, to take these things out of fictional context, though. So for instance, sometimes people ask me, well, why isn't Mickey Mouse a monster? It's just Mouse that wears shorts and talks. Well, my response is, I submit if you were to open your bedroom door and see a talking mouse in shorts, you would be fucking horrified, right? We can make fictional places for these things. But that's a very different matter from the idea of an actual, encounter.
All right, wonderful. So next up we have Sarah.
Thank you so much, David and Joel. This is really interesting, and I apologize if I'm not super clear in my question. I was thinking, so I thought, David, I don't know if you were gonna go there at some point, but when you were talking about Carol's discussion about horrors, and I think I've read that paper a while ago, and now I can't remember it, but I'm sure what I'm about to make is a non-original point, which is that in a lot of horror movies, the source of horror comes from people who are disabled, right? We would define as disabled, either mentally because they're mentally ill or cognitively disabled in some ways or other, or in specific ways that are like evil, right? They're presented as evil in a certain kind of folk understanding, or they are physically disabled. I mean, sometimes in ways that are not realistic, like people with scissor hands, but people have how do you say in English? See, that's where I'm tired. I'm sorry, the word doesn't come.
It's okay.
But you know what I mean, like things that are in place of artificial limbs.
Yes.
And of course, they don't look like Edward Scissorhands, but so and is that, and it, so my question is, I mean, I'm sure this has been studied, but I've never thought about connecting this issues in philosophy of disability in horror movies and dehumanization. And so I was wondering whether you were going to talk about the intersection of these three topics. Sorry, this is a terrible question. I'm very sorry.
No,
from my session.
It's not terrible. I mean, I think that, first of all, and let me preface this by reminding you that I'm a newcomer to this particular area. A great deal of the literature on horror fiction and disability focuses on the evil characters in horror fiction as disabled, and they are indeed often represented as disabled. I think there's a lot more to do here. Yes, the fact that disabled people or certain people with certain sorts of disabilities, and I think my theory would actually make some predictions about what sort of disabilities elicit these sorts of responses, elicit reactions of horror, are referred to traditionally, it's not socially acceptable anymore, but I bet people think it as monsters. And I do think that the apparatus for making sense of horror fiction is applicable here. As I think I've shown that it's immensely applicable to making sense of racialized humanization as well. So all these things come together, but even though I struggled to do something within 20 minutes, I failed at that. So it would have come together a little bit more. I think there's another component as well, actually, to this, which is a connection between disability and racialization. I mean, one of the very striking things, if we look at the intellectual history of attitudes towards race, is the idea that members of subordinate races suffer from a chronic endogenous disability. And sometimes this is explicitly represented in medical terms. For instance, Benjamin Rush, the colonial American psychiatrist, thought that Blackness was a form of leprosy, an inherited form of leprosy. And you can go through this literature, and there's just lots and lots and lots of this stuff. One of Dr. Mengele's prisoner assistants, a physician, in her testimony said that she thought Mengele thought of Jews as like congenitally disabled people, who he, by the way, was very interested in experimenting. So there are lots, I think, of extremely rich, extremely enlightening interconnections between these various zones of horror, attitudes towards disability, dehumanizing attitudes towards disability, and dehumanization more generally.
Okay, wonderful. Next we have Rebecca.
Thanks so much for the talk, David, and for the commentary, Joel. It was, this is really, really interesting and important work.
Thank you.
My question was sort of, I think, picking up on something that you were just saying about what sort of predictions the view that you're developing will have about which disabilities will be viewed as metaphysical threats. Because I was thinking about sort of, I think this came up in Joel's comments as well about aging and how, a lot of us will have various disabilities, either, when we're young or more likely when we're older. And so I was wondering sort of, it's not clear to me, I guess I was wondering, do you think that the disabilities that many people come to have as they age are viewed as metaphysical threats? And if not, what do you think it is about the disabilities that we associate with aging that would sort of, I guess, determine whether they're viewed as metaphysical threats or not?
I think
how are we carving up the disabilities?
I think it would depend. I would guess that with respect, aging is disturbing for other rather obvious reasons. The older I get, the more acquainted I am with it, which is that it reminds us of death. And we certainly get less pretty as we age. But yeah, there are certain forms of disability which one might associate it with aging. I would guess dementia would be experienced by many somewhat as a metaphysical threat. But I doubt if the disabilities that are specifically tied to aging are particularly metaphysically threatening in the sense that I mean. The sorts of disabilities, and even disability is the wrong word, because what we're dealing with are bodily variations, which accommodations or not, may not impede any kind of function at all. So let's say certain kinds of bodily variations. So my theory would predict, and this here I'm extrapolating from my other work on dehumanization, the more well-developed work, are variations to the human face, in particular human eyes, and secondarily limbs. I think that the faces are uniquely powerful in eliciting the human response, and of faces, eyes. So any major variation there, I think is likely to be experienced by many people as extremely, extremely disturbing and threatening, and limbs secondarily.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take one last question from Christine.
I'm not even going to pretend this is a question. So I just have a response to the first question that was asked regarding, I think it was robots or AI that has resemblance to humans. And I just thought about Shelley Park's really amazing work on AI. She talks about this concept in engineering called the Uncanny Valley, which has to do with how if AI or robots or whatever sorts of entities are too similar to humans, that we tend to get really uncomfortable. So I just wanted to throw that out there, because there is that tie with uncanniness. I don't know if you want to go the direction of robots at all.
Yes, certainly. And in fact, I should have mentioned that. So Maury, who I quoted in what I read to you, he's the author of the paper called The Uncanny Valley. Actually, the Japanese word bukimi, I think uncanny, the English uncanny doesn't quite do it justice, just like it doesn't do Unheimlich justice. Valley of Creepiness might be a better translation of the title of that paper. And essentially what Maury did was reinvent Jensch's work, specifically in a robotics context. So Maury predicted that as humanoid robots become more and more realistic, we'll get more and more comfortable with them until they're almost indistinguishable, but not quite indistinguishable from human beings, at which point there'll be a precipitous fall in our comfort level, and we'll experience them as bukimi, as uncanny. There's a large cognitive science literature on this. I think most of it is rather superficial. The point is, there's this, this flipping point where you cannot help but experience the robot as both human and non-human. That elicits this disturbing response. And you can observe this in yourself. There are videos of very realistic humanoid robots, but it's something like about them. Now, just as an aside, because it's relevant to this, and then I'll shut up. In the same paper, Maury talks about prosthetic limbs. And he suggests that prosthetic limbs should not try to approximate non-prosthetic limbs, because it will never be completely right. And this, is it a hand or is it not a hand state, will elicit an attitude of horror on the part of those who observe it.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm going to thank David and Joel once again for the very interesting talk and commentary. We'll do the little applause again. Okay, so Licia, we're going to move on to you and to your talk now.
Okay, great. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. I'm trying to, oh, there goes my applause. I don't want to keep applauding for myself here. So I actually have a few PowerPoint slides just so that my arguments are clear. And I'm going to echo David and also read my paper, because otherwise I will speak for too long. Sorry, I'm just trying to share my screen here.
Do you have a share screen option available?
I do. Sorry, I just got a new computer here, and this is
Take your time. I just wanted to make sure that that was enabled for you.
Yeah, no, it is. It's my computer issue here. Let's see. I don't know why it's not allowing me here. All right, well, I'm not going to waste time on this. Sorry, I'm gonna, it's my computer problem. So I think I'll just go ahead and read, if that's okay. So first of all, I just want to thank everybody on the panel. I especially want to thank Joel for this wonderful invitation, and both David and Joel for these really, really thought-provoking papers. And actually, I think much of what I'll say resonates deeply with what they've discussed. So there's a long, horrifying legacy of the dehumanization of people with disabilities. And though I'm new to the field of dehumanization studies, my own work on intellectual disability, and I'll use ID for short here, has centered in part upon the ways that these persons have been dehumanized, both past and present, both concretely and philosophically. But acquainting myself with the literature on dehumanization has made me realize how important conceptual clarity is, not just for the sake of abstract argumentation, but because the stakes are so high. And this is a point that David has made in his work, which I found really, really helpful. So for some people with disabilities, their dehumanization has meant being kept unclothed and abused in institutions, forced sterilization, being defined as subhuman, and in some scientific taxonomies, below not just non-human animals, but even below plants, placed on the margins of personhood, and in the worst cases, subject to mass killings, like the T4 program during the Holocaust that David described. So rather than presenting a fully polished argument today, I just want to share some of my reflections and a number of questions that have emerged as I've been acquainting myself with dehumanization studies. So I'm going to start with a consideration of the connections between dehumanization and animalizing disability. Then I'm going to argue for the importance of doing both historical and philosophical work on the dehumanization of people with intellectual or cognitive disabilities in particular, and then conclude with some final thoughts on why this question is so urgent. And I just want to say for clarification, when I use the term intellectual and cognitive disability, I don't believe that these are necessarily fixed natural kinds in any sense, but I think they demarcate a large category of individuals who've been defined as disabled based on various cognitive, developmental, or intellectual impairments. And I was thinking as David was giving his paper that it's also important to consider the affective response to people who have visible disabilities as opposed to maybe invisible disabilities, and how those may differ. So the first section on animalizing disability. One of the hallmarks of the ways that people with ID have been dehumanized is through their associations with non-human animals. So in my book, The Faces of Intellectual Disability, I've outlined many of these associations that take different forms and that can be found in both institutional and scientific discourse in the late 19th to mid 20th century. But these comparisons and associations are also found in more contemporary moral discourse about the moral status of people with ID. So for example, in Singer, Jeff McMahon's work, as Joel alluded to. So I don't want to rehearse these arguments, these anti-speciesist arguments here, but rather I just want to explore some of the questions that debates in dehumanization studies might raise when we think about intellectual disability. So I want to begin by just asserting that one of the most pervasive and harmful forms of dehumanization that people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities have faced is animalization. But this argument has been challenged on several fronts. So in other words, the argument that animalizing intellectual disability is harmful. In Alice Crary's article, Dehumanization and the Question of Animals, Crary is wary of dehumanization critics who rely on arguments that insist that dehumanized people are not animals. She argues that while she understands this move, it runs the risk of, quote, reinscribing the subjugation of animals, end quote. So in her view, this can only be avoided if, quote, those who speak for affirming the value of animalized humans simply as humans, at the same time affirm the value of animals simply as the creatures that they are, and not as being somehow inferior to humans. So Crary's argument is quite nuanced and complex, and I can't do it justice here. But I do want to argue that I think it is possible to adopt a stance that does not claim that human beings are superior to animals, while still arguing that intellectually disabled people are not non-human animals. There's a difference between arguing that human beings are better than non-human animals and arguing against treating human beings in ways that are inappropriate given that they are human. To keep a being unclothed, for example, is not something we would argue harms a non-human animal. And yet the treatment of so many intellectually disabled people in institutional settings bears evidence to this form of dehumanization, which must be resisted precisely because they are not non-human animals. And the harrowing images of institutions like Willowbrook come to mind. To resist this miscategorization says nothing about the worth of the non-human animal. Rather, it protests the profound harms that result from drawing an equivalence between kinds in certain circumstances. Harriet Over presents 7 challenges to what she calls the dehumanization hypothesis, which basically is this idea that there's a causal relationship between dehumanization and intergroup harm based on perceiving this group as somehow similar to non-humans. Yet here, the case of intellectual disability can complicate and challenge certain aspects of her arguments. So one of her arguments is that, quote, groups are often persecuted because of their humanity. In other words, not because of their absence of humanity. While this may be true, that does not mean that the same individuals might not also simultaneously be defined and harmed by virtue of their perceived subhuman status. And both Joel and David have talked about this. I mean, I find this element in David's work so interesting. This idea that part of the way dehumanization functions is to posit that an individual is both human and subhuman at the same time. And there's actually really interesting evidence of this contradictory view in the history of intellectual disability. So, and I talk about this in my book, the feeble-minded or people with intellectual disabilities were defined simultaneously in both qualitative and quantitative ways with respect to the category of the human. So they were simultaneously viewed as departures from a norm, hence the quantitative designation of them as lower on the scale of human development. And think about even terms like mental retardation. So the idea of being sort of on a lower scale of the human. But also they were defined as qualitatively distinct species. This paradoxical view of the other as simultaneously an abnormal human and a subhuman justified many of the horrific abuses that they suffered. So in challenging the animalization of people with ID, I am not defending speciesism. I am not arguing for the relative preference or value of human beings over non-human animals. In fact, I'm very sympathetic to work like Crary's and Sonara Taylor's book, Beasts of Burden, which is a fabulous book that chart liberatory strategies for people with disabilities and non-human animals together and analyze how the dynamics of oppression function in similar and overlapping ways. However, I do want to maintain that analyzing the animalization of disability on its own terms in both concrete and theoretical forms is crucial, as this distinct form of dehumanization remains a serious and potentially lethal practice. And this is something that I'll talk about at the end. Okay, the second part, how am I doing in terms of speed of talking for the captions? Is it okay? Okay, the second part is on historical and philosophical phases of dehumanization. So many who have worked on the history of intellectual disability, myself included, have addressed dehumanization in various forms. However, taking a page from dehumanization studies, I think there is tremendous value in exploring this history further in ways that are explicitly centered upon the dynamics of dehumanization. So there's a complex story to be told. And again, David's paper alluded to this, about how disability figures into the dehumanization of other groups and the intersections between disability and other dehumanized identities. In his article, Disability and the Justification of Inequality in American History, historian Douglas Bainton argues that, quote, disability has functioned as a sign of and a justification for inferiority in relation to many groups, including African Americans, women. Because of this attribution, though, many groups, he says, have engaged in what he calls a kind of distancing discourse, whereby they rightly disavow attributions of disability. Yet what remains unchallenged, Bainton argues, is the very idea of disability itself as a legitimate justification for inequality. So I think Bainton's analysis prompts a number of really interesting questions. In considering how other groups based on race, ethnicity, gender are dehumanized, what role does the attribution of disability, and we might say cognitive or intellectual disability in particular, play in dehumanization? How does ableism function to bolster the dehumanization of both disabled and non-disabled individuals? And how do the dynamics of dehumanization differ in cases of intellectual disability? So for example, historically, people defined as quote unquote feeble-minded were dehumanized and defined as subhuman in a myriad of settings and contexts, and for many different reasons, to justify their treatment, for purely definitional or taxonomic purposes, for political and economic reasons, and of course, for eugenic purposes. So in many cases, this was not due to ethno-racial differences, the kinds that Smith discusses, but rather an assemblage of what Rob Wilson has called eugenic traits, which included both cognitive and moral impairments. So this raises the question of whether it makes sense to distinguish perhaps between trait-based or capacity-based forms of dehumanization and ethno-racial group-based forms of dehumanization, and also to consider how the two may be interrelated. Moving on to philosophical phases of dehumanization, I have explored what I call conceptual forms of oppression, where people with ID are dehumanized at the hands of philosophers. So reading this literature on dehumanization has prompted me to reconsider some of these philosophical arguments and to revisit the idea of what philosophical dehumanization might mean. Animalizing disability, I think, is one example of this, but I think there may be others. So we can ask, what does it mean to dehumanize disabled people within philosophical discourse specifically? And do these instances of dehumanization function in similar or in different ways from other contexts? The history of intellectual disability reveals that dehumanization took place at a number of levels: definitions, treatment, moral, political, and social ends. So do we find parallels in philosophical discourse? Okay, thank you. Another question that we can ask is, what does it mean to critique dehumanization without a working definition of the human? And this is something that, that both papers addressed, and I hope we can talk more about. But I think this question has taken on a different hue in the wake of post-humanist and transhumanist arguments that want to challenge, blur, and even erase the line between the human and the non-human. So does placing the human aside or jettisoning the concept altogether amount to a different kind of de/humanization? And what are the political, social, and philosophical implications of these moves for people with disabilities? As Harriet McBride Johnson, the disability activist and lawyer, wrote in her reflections on her meetings with Peter Singer, she says, quote, "Because I am still seeking acceptance of my humanity, Singer's call to get past species seems a luxury way beyond my reach." So what does it mean to move beyond the human for those whose humanness is still in question? What is the impact of moving from subhuman directly to post or transhuman for individuals with the most profound disabilities who have been relegated to the margins of the human? And what role might these individuals play in strategies of rehumanization or reimagining post-human subjectivity, as Rosie Braidotti argues in her book on posthumanism? So does rehumanizing, or do these new movements include individuals with intellectual disabilities, or might they be reinscribing certain patterns of dehumanization that they are actually intended to critique? So just in the last remaining few minutes, I just want to end by pointing out 3 concrete ways in which this question is urgent and pressing. The first is that we are entering into the 3rd year of this pandemic, and we have seen calls for triage protocols that would deny care to people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities solely based on their disability and not based on their health status. Thankfully, after considerable pushback from disability advocates and activists and certain bioethicists, including people here, many of these proposals were not enacted. However, the question remains, how do dehumanizing assumptions shape the social, bioethical, and clinical imaginary and justify morally problematic courses of action? Second, how does dehumanization play a role in the continued abuse and violence that so many people with ID suffer in residential settings and institutional settings and beyond? So how do the dynamics of dehumanization either overtly or covertly fuel this mistreatment? And then finally, as I've briefly touched upon, advances in science and technology are ushering in a new era, an era of genomics, transhumanism, and posthumanism. What are the implications of these new technologies and movements for people with ID? How will they figure into this new landscape? And what strategies are possible for those who are not able to partake in these debates and movements? Finally, what does it mean to move from subhuman to posthuman for someone whose very humanness has been denied? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Licia. That was really thought-provoking. Okay, Corinne, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Corinne. I'm a white femme-presenting person with dark brown hair, round glasses, and I'm wearing an oversized gray shirt and sitting in my office at home. So thank you so much, Dr. Carlson. I'm very excited to be responding to the paper, and I very much appreciate how many questions it poses. I think that's an exciting way to initiate a dialogue in a conference like this. I'm going to focus my commentary on two questions. The first concerns the relationship between the dehumanization of disabled people and processes of racial dehumanization. And then the second one concerns the category of the human at stake in dehumanization discourses and the relationship between dehumanization and various projects of overcoming the human or moving past the human, etc. And I think that both are connected. So I'll start with the relationship between disability and race in a sense. So disability has functioned historically as a justification for the dehumanization of Black and other non-white people. The behaviors, beliefs, physical appearance, and bodily and cognitive capacities of non-white people have been pathologized as deviant and abnormal to justify violent treatment and structural inequality. The work of Douglas Baton, to which Dr. Carlson refers, and others, shows that the category of disability has been employed historically to control and marginalize subjugated groups. Furthermore, non-white people were and continue to be systemically disabled by systems of white supremacy, imperialism, and capitalism. As many scholars of disability and race have shown, disability always materializes within transnational contexts marked by racial subjugation and violence. In her book, Disability and Difference in Global Contexts, Nirmala Aravelis shows that Black slaves were constituted through categories of race, gender, and disability as, quote, dehumanized commodities, end of quote, that were instrumental to the development and expansion of capitalism in the Western world. In other words, the transatlantic slave trade produced Black disabled bodies, both literally through brutal violence and inhumane living conditions, and conceptually by framing Blackness as the very embodiment of abject difference. To adopt Dr. Carlson's terminology in this paper, Black slaves were both conceptually and materially dehumanized through vectors of disability. In this example, but also in many others, racial-based dehumanization and trait or capacity-based dehumanization reinforce each other, thus making them difficult to distinguish. This is not to say that both dynamics of dehumanization should be flattened to each other. We must preserve the distinction between them, and I fully agree with Dr. Carlson that conceptual clarity is necessary in these questions. I do wonder, however, how our understanding of dehumanization might change if we begin with the assumption that the category of disability is racialized from the start. On this view, the dehumanization of disabled people and the dehumanization of certain racial groups are not merely tangentially connected. They are deeply interwoven with the legacy of liberal humanism and with its classed, gendered, racialized, and capacitated notion of the human. In fact, I would argue that the study of dehumanization requires that we engage critically with the category of the human itself. And this brings me to my second point. In her essay, Dr. Carlson observes that the construction of the disabled or racial other paradoxically relies on her positioning as both an abnormal human and a subhuman. In other words, and we've discussed this throughout the talks, the other is both internally marked as different and pathologized, and liminally positioned as a different type of species beyond what counts as human. The figure of the other, in sum, challenges the presumed fixity of the human at the same time as it consolidates this category's power and authority. Within liberal humanist traditions, having one's humanity recognized by others is a precondition for ethical relationality. In contrast, systemic denials of a group or person's humanity generate serious physical, epistemic, and social and political harms. The harms of dehumanization listed by Dr. Carlson at the end of her essay reflect this very clearly. Yet there is also reason to be concerned with the ways in which the category of the human has been deployed historically to bolster norms of bodily and cognitive capacity and white and cis heterosexist supremacy. Disabled people have every reason to reject ableist forms of dehumanization. Yet there remains the issue of whether hegemonic forms of the human should be embraced at all. I am not suggesting a turn to posthumanism that disposes with questions of material and structural inequality or advances an abstract and disembodied posthuman subjectivity. As Dr. Carlson observes it, any call for moving beyond the human, quote, must confront the privilege and ableist assumptions that undergird these newer liberatory projects, end of quote. But I'm thinking here, for example, of the work done by Zakiya Iman Jackson in her recent book titled Becoming Human, Matter and Meaning in an Anti-Black World. Jackson's book is not about disability per se, but it engages many important questions about dehumanization, animality, and the limits of the human. Becoming Human extends a legacy of work by Black theorists challenging the epistemic authority of the human. Jackson argues that the animalization of Blackness will not be overturned by the inclusion of Black people into liberal conceptions of humanity. In this book, she studies work by Black artists that seek to, quote, alter the meaning and significance of being human and generate conceptions of being that defy the disparagement of the non-human and the animal, end of quote. What I suggest we take from Jackson's intervention is the possibility of a third way, neither a bid for inclusion into humanity that props up other forms of exclusion, nor the concrete and conceptual violence of dehumanization, but a critical appraisal of the category of the human itself and, ultimately, an attempt at its disruption. In a sense, I take Jackson to be grappling with Dr. Carlson's question, and I'm citing her here, what does it mean to move beyond the human for those whose humanness is still in question, end of quote. This is the question that I'm left with after reading and now hearing this fantastic essay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corinne. That was fantastic. Okay, Licia, you've got 5 minutes to reply, or as much time within 5 minutes as you'd like.
Great. Thank you so much, Corinne. And, I read this before and I really, there's so much in your response, and I'm really sympathetic to everything that you've pointed out, and it's really helped me clarify some of what I think needs to be articulated more fully in my own work. So thank you. And just to describe myself, I'm white, identify as female, sitting in a chair with plants behind me, with gray hair, a black top and a gray jacket. So I guess just really a sort of gesture of gratitude to you for your commentary. So the first point that you make about really viewing disability as already racialized as a category, I think is absolutely correct. I'm in full agreement with that. And I realize that the way in which I set up Bainton's arguments may seem as if it's sort of an add-on, and I definitely don't want to argue that, because I think there's no question that disability as a lived experience and identity is through and through racialized, gendered. I mean, it's defined in all of those ways. So in that respect, I completely agree. one point that you brought up that I think is especially interesting and intriguing, and maybe we can talk about this in the discussion, is this idea of disability being produced through practices of dehumanization. So I had sort of looked at it in the opposite way, the ways in which people with disabilities are dehumanized. But I think there's such a long history of showing that practices of dehumanization actually render certain individuals disabled in various ways. So I'm grateful for you for bringing that up. And I guess the last thing I just want to say is that I'm really intrigued by your proposal at the end of your commentary for a kind of third way to find that neither, you say it's neither a bid for inclusion into humanity, nor, but rather a critical appraisal of the human itself, and ultimately an attempt at its disruption. So I guess I'll just end by saying this is what I've wrestled with, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be on this panel, because I'm still wrestling with it. And that is, what concept of the human is necessary or desirable in order to critique dehumanization. And I know, I mean, you know, in David's work, and I hope it's okay, I'm calling you David, we had never met before, but you know, the idea that the human is transparent and that it's a fiction, on the one hand, I'm very sympathetic to that. And yet at the same time, I feel like there's a tension in terms of where do we find traction to be able to refute or criticize dehumanization without defining the human in some sense. And Joel's paper gets at that as well. So I'll end there, and thank you so much for such thorough and thoughtful responses to my paper. So thank you, and I'm glad you're here.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let's open it up to Q&A. I see a question in the chat from Carlos. Okay. Okay, Corinne.
Yeah, maybe I can break the ice. I just wanted to respond to Dr. Carlson's response. I think that the way that you
call me Licia.
Okay. I think that the way that you worded it at the end is very helpful in terms of, so, you know, of course, I'm presenting this kind of, I think that Jackson's work is really interesting because of trying to carve out this third way. And I think that the way that she does it through analyzing different types of Black cultural production is very helpful. But I also think that concretely there is the difficulty that you're pointing to, where it's not exactly clear to me either what disrupting, how we can do both, you know, the work of disrupting this category because of its legacy, and at the same time having enough traction to criticize concrete, material, and practical forms of dehumanization, such as the ones that you list, you know, the contemporary forms of dehumanization of disabled people during COVID, for example. And so I think that's I just wanted to say that I think that's a really helpful way of saying that also a helpful way of recognizing that there is like conceptual work to be done. And then there's also like that conception, you know, there's also like very concrete and practical and urgent matters when we think about dehumanization in general. And so, yeah.
Licia, would you like to reply?
Sorry, no, I actually just kind of wanted to punt the question to Joel and David to see whether, especially, I mean, David, your work, which I've now just begun to get acquainted with, speaks about this. And I was going to email you actually in advance to ask you this question, but I'll ask you here, just sort of what your response is to this quandary, or if you even see it as a quandary, and same for Joel.
Well, can you specify the quandary a little bit more?
I guess whether we or whoever's engaging in theorizing and critiquing dehumanization need some working definition of the human in order for there to be the dehumanizing aspect of it to critique.
Yeah, so I don't see it as a problem. I mean, the general point was first made, I think, by Nick Haslam, who's the main social psychologist who does dehumanization. I have a lot of disagreements with how he does it, but that's the central point. And he proposes a concept of the human to use in that fashion. But like I said earlier, let me put it a little bit differently. So I like to compare the concept of the human to the concept of a weed. Weed isn't a botanical category. So a Martian looking at all the things that I would call weeds in my yard would be very puzzled because there's nothing that all and only of them share of a biological nature. A weed is a kind, the nature of which is determined by its relationship to our practices of horticulture and so on. I think human is like that as well. And therefore human is what we make it. Now, when I say what we make it, I don't mean individually. I don't think we philosophers sitting in our seminar rooms can make any modification of the notion of the human whatsoever. And the notion of the human as it's practiced in our culture has a vast weight of history behind it. But it is malleable. It is malleable. So we can expand that boundary or contract it in principle as we wish. Now, I think it's an important category. I think that our existence, our social existence depends on some notion of the us. I don't think that can possibly be dispensed with. And because I think the category of the human is ultimately means the us, that's what it names, however conceived, then it is inevitably retained. So if dehumanization versus the human can be reconfigured as the us, and more specifically the essential us, or the natural kind that we are, versus the not us in that fundamental essentialized way. We can change the language, but I don't think we can get rid of the binary.
I'll just add that I'm very torn about this because part of me agrees with everything, of course, that David just said, but then there's another part of me that thinks about certain indigenous conceptions of the cosmos, where the category of the human doesn't, as far as I can tell, seem to play the sort of role that us Western, I don't know what you that we whatever the we is here, that often assume is like necessary for certain types of either social bonding or whatever it might be, and it's not clear to me. I don't know. I feel uncomfortable making any grand claims about what sort of concepts are necessary historically, but it does seem, having said that, so having articulated that concern, in 2022, right now, the world in which we live, it seems like human rights discourse, as problematic as it is, and I have lots to critique about it, still seems like the most powerful tool in town to actually move actual existing levers of power right now. So on the one hand, I want to have my, complaint, philosophical questions and historical worries here, but on the other, I want to be like, we need a let's just double down on this for lots of practical reasons. Let's double down. I just want to throw out one question I had. Should I do it now, or do we want to go to Drew? I don't know who is first.
Well, if it's let's go to Drew and then we'll come back to you, Joel.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, Drew.
Joel was first. But can you hear me?
Yeah, you got
Okay.
the floor.
Okay, so I finally came out of the woods there. That was my profile pic for a while. I was eating lunch and I didn't want to horrify everybody with that display. But I've been enjoying the presentations very much. I was wanting to learn a bit more about this area of literature. Just full disclosure, I teach a lot of applied ethics and also aesthetics. And in applied ethics, I've recently become uncomfortable in the last year or two with marginal human concept and just not wanting to use it anymore when talking about abortion, for one, and also when talking about treatment of non-human animals, which is a topic you were addressing just now. And I got in the hand line because I was just going to throw out the question, hey, what do y'all think about abortion? And the way the concept of human gets thrown around there, just to see if anyone wanted to take it up and play with it, because that could help me in approaching the topic in my classroom. But if you don't mind, I'd like to just really quickly approach the question that Licia is wanting us to all be thinking about, which I think is really interesting. It's kind of a paradox of let's not put too much weight on the concept of human, yet normatively we want to avoid dehumanization, right? And I was recently, for some reason, because I think about the concept of the sacred, I was thinking about torture and how an argument against torturing humans is that, a religious argument, is that humans are made in the image of God. That's a Western religious argument. And there's something a little odd about that, though, because it seems like the same reason it's wrong to torture humans is the reason why it's wrong to torture non-human animals, right? So whatever is dehumanizing about torturing humans, it's also dehumanizing in the same way to torture non-human animals. So when I think about that idea, I just feel like the word human's wrong. It just doesn't really have an application. And I think the paradox leads us perhaps to the really odd position where maybe we shouldn't talk about dehumanization. Or all it means is that's the sort of being that we don't want to do wrong. And when it comes to dogs, we don't want to de-dogify or whatever. When it comes to cats, we don't want to undermine their status as beings who have moral status. So I don't know if that helps at all, but I'll go back to the just question I wanted to throw out there. Do you have any perspective on abortion and how to avoid talk of marginal humans and such in that very complex debate? Does anyone have a take on that? I'm just curious.
I have a section on a short section on abortion and dehumanization in my most recent book. I'd have to explain too much in order to explain it in this context, but you could check that out.
Does anyone else want to comment on that point?
I'll just say that go ahead.
No, go ahead, Joel.
When I teach on this topic, I always end, I do the order differently. It depends. It's usually a 2 or 3 week kind of module, but I always end with looking at the reproductive justice movement and the ways in which there has now for decades been ways of thinking about the quote unquote abortion debate that do not, as far as I can tell, center questions about the human, do not center debates over souls, do not center, like all of the stuff that I'm not sure we will ever agree upon is set to the side, and there's a more holistic understanding of the role of reproduction within a society, and concerns about equity and justice at play. And I found that a lot of students, no matter what their background is and no matter what their views are on the debate, they appreciate it when we get to that part, and they usually some bells go off. So, but that's all I can say on that topic in this context.
Licia, did you want to add anything?
I actually, if you don't mind, wanted to go back to your the previous comment before, just about the torture example, which I think is a really interesting one. And I think, this idea that, maybe paradoxically we need to do away with the language of dehumanization, I sort of come back to so many of the examples in some of David's work, looking at this practice in the context of war and genocide, and the ways in which this language and sort of arguments of dehumanization are really weaponized and really used for particular aims. And so I guess I would just sort of add another layer of complexity there, to think about also not just sort of the fate of the human and how we're defining that, but also thinking about the aims of various forms of dehumanization. I ran out of time, but one of the points that I make in the paper is that we can talk about political or social ends, we can talk about philosophical or moral aims, but I think there are also epistemic aims at trying to define certain categories or individuals as subhuman. So I guess I would want to say that even though there are examples of kind of dehumanizing animals, and torture is an example of that, I do think that the concept of dehumanization in relation to beings qua human is its own sort of, set of practices and categories that are worthy of attention.
Joel, do you want to come back in with the question that you had a few moments ago?
Sure. I'm sorry that Corinne had to leave, because it's in some respects in response to what they said, but I'll also throw it out there because I would love to hear David and Licia's thoughts. If I followed the argument correctly, one of the things that Corinne was trying to point out is the ways in which, the plural ways in which, processes of racialization and processes of, habilitation and debility, I'm not sure how we want to phrase that, are intertwined. And there's all sorts of concrete examples that we can point to where it's hard to pull these apart. And I want to grant that is true as a, let's say, something like a hermeneutic tool, that we don't want to just think, oh, there's dehumanization with respect to people with disabilities over in this bucket, then there's a bucket of how it works with regards to questions of racialization. That seems wrong. And yet it seems, at least David, if I'm following where your thinking is at right now, you still do want to keep these quite distinct in certain ways. And so I just want to hear more about this, like what's at stake in keeping them distinct? Is there a danger there that we're not thinking about the ways in which these processes are, more often than not, it seems, interlinked in terms of concrete cases? I would just like to hear more on that.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm a person who likes to make distinctions rather than lump things together, and I think it's particularly important here, and it's important because, from my thinking and my research and so on, these various forms of derogatory belief involve different dynamics, and it doesn't do anyone any good to obscure that by sort of running them all together. Now, you could make just a semantic move. You could say, there's this kind of dehumanization and that kind of dehumanization. That's fine, as long as we distinguish between what I think needs to be distinguished between theoretically and with respect to our amelioratory practices, right? So we want to solve these problems, right? Well, if we want to solve these problems, we need to know how they work. So I think there are some cases where I think the distinction is quite sharp. One of my more eccentric views is I don't think that women are dehumanized as women. I think that the process there, it's a different phenomenon when we're looking at sexism and misogyny. And it certainly can be theorized, and it's very important to theorize it because we want to get rid of it. But what's going on there is really quite different than what's going on in, say, exterminationist dehumanization in the context of genocide. Now, the case of disability. For some time, I've thought it's closer to the kind of dehumanization that I've written about than lots of other things. And in wrapping my mind around what I was going to say in this panel, that's only confirmed me in that. It's not the same thing, but it's close enough so that I think much of the same way that we make sense of the kind of racialized dehumanization that I've researched can be deployed, with appropriate modifications for understanding the dehumanization of disabled people.
Thank you, David. Licia, do you want to come in? I see you've unmuted yourself.
Sure. The Zoom sign of the desire to speak. I mean, I guess I'll just add to that and say that one of the things that that this panel and just working on this paper has got me thinking about too is, given the heterogeneity of disability as a category, and then even within the broad category of, let's say, cognitive or intellectual disability, that there are so many various designations and subgroups. Stepping back, it really, for me, raises this question of sort of group identification and the coherence of groups and the ways in which it seems that the process of dehumanization at once sort of posits a coherent group for its purposes, and yet at the same time, the theorizing of dehumanization or the critiquing of dehumanization requires us to at once sort of speak in terms of group designations, while at the same time, I think where some of the really interesting sort of the rich work here comes in as David said, in teasing apart these differences, because I think there are differences. I mean, just looking at the history of intellectual disability itself, I think there are so many examples of how there are very specific mechanisms and dynamics of dehumanization that just simply did not apply to other groups that were not defined according to some sort of assumed cognitive or intellectual disability. So I think this question of kind of group membership versus capacity or trait-based, for me is something that I hope to look at more closely and hear more about from others.
Well, thank you so much, Licia. On that excellent point, we're at time, so I'm going to say let's thank all of our panelists one more time. That was a really robust and fantastic conversation. And I hope that everybody has a great rest of their day, and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.